Hello, I'm Tone Lanzillo, and this is Climate-Duluth. Our guest today is Dana Fisher. Dana is the director of the Center for Environment, Community, and Equity, and a professor at the School of International Service at American University in Washington, D.C. She's also the author of a book that grabbed my attention several weeks ago, entitled Saving Ourselves from Climate Shocks to Climate Action. It's great to have you here today, Dana.
Thank you so much for having me, Tone.
Um, why don't we just start with the book? Tell us a little bit about this book, why you chose to write this book, and your hopes for the book. Yeah.
Sure. So the book actually came out of 25 or so years doing work studying and documenting policymaking around climate change, climate action, and also writing too many papers on climate policy failure. So I spent my years, I'm a political sociologist, which means I document policymaking processes. I've studied all the policies that failed. And I also have studied the way that climate action comes from the bottom up. So the role that people power plays. And I actually was asked to write for the most recent IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Assessment Report. I was asked to write a new section on civic engagement and civic activism and the role that citizens play in addressing the climate crisis and the role that they could play to get us where we need to go on climate. And out of that experience, plus having studied and documented all of these climate policy failures, I felt like it was time to write something for the general public so that we could understand where we are and where we need to go. And so that's what Saving Ourselves is. I think of it as like a well-documented manifesto in some ways, thinking about, the reality of the climate crisis, what the science tells us, but then what, the science coming from my research and many others tells us about how we can push back and get us where we need to go and limit the climate crisis so that we can, quite frankly, save ourselves. And so that's where it came from. And my hope is that it really is embraced by people and people use it as a way of thinking about what they personally can do, because there are so many opportunities for us to get involved, but we're also inundated with depressing news right now, quite frankly. I mean, I know you all are probably experiencing air quality alerts right now from the fires up in Canada. And, we are starting to see warnings about tropical storms coming from hurricane season, which is just kicking off. So these are dangerous times. And so saving ourselves is all about what we individually can do and what we as a collective can do to address the problems that are facing us.
You're right. I appreciate your comment about the wildfires. We're currently under a red alert as far as air qualities, I think till this evening, due to the fires in Manitoba, Canada. Um, in the early part of your book, you wrote the following or comments that current responses to the climate crisis from the state, market, and civil society sectors are not saving us from a warming center. And with that, you also talk about um, a massive shock, that a massive shock may be necessary, one that's severe and durable, to open up this window of opportunity for us to take action. Like, reflection on those two statements. Yeah.
Well, I mean, what I basically do in the beginning of the book is, I mean, as I say in the book, I call myself an apocalyptic optimist, which means that I believe that we can save ourselves from the climate crisis, but I also am acutely aware of what the science tells us about what's coming and where we are in the climate crisis. I mean, we didn't experience, but the world just experienced a disaster of a whole town because of a glacier melting because of global warming. We're seeing, these wildfires across Canada, air quality alerts because of that, flooding, and many climate exacerbated, what I call climate shocks, climate exacerbated extreme events hitting all over the world. And what we know from the research is that when people experience these kinds of crises, it opens up windows of opportunity for policymaking and social change. And what I think about and I talk about in the book is the way that that kind of what I call a risk pivot, or this feeling of risk personally, can motivate us to make real changes in our lives, changes that we might not otherwise believe are possible. And so what I talk about as, a way of thinking through the degree to which we need to experience these kinds of shocks is thinking about the way that we changed our lives after COVID hit, after we had lockdowns and all of these things. I mean, I was teaching undergraduates at the University of Maryland when COVID was coming. And it happened to be that I was teaching a course where we were focusing on risk for the few weeks prior to that. So I thought, oh, it'd be really interesting to look at this disease that I heard that's spreading in China as, something to talk about when we were talking about the readings. Because I always try to bring in, what's happening in the world when I talk about the readings for my undergrads. So I started tracking the pandemic and how the pandemic was growing. And we started watching videos of people on YouTube that you may or may not have seen who were in lockdown in Italy and all over the world. And one of the things that we learned from the COVID pandemic is that when people start to feel a real sense of risk, they're willing to make big changes. The state makes changes, businesses make changes, but in a lot of cases, it's built, it's responding to pressures from the public like us.
Mhm.
And so what we learned from COVID is that social change is really necessary at the level that's needed, the systemic changes, but it takes a big shock. And we also learned that the shock has to be durable and last for us to be willing to continue to take on these changes, because we're already in this system that, has put us on a path towards burning more and more fossil fuels, which is causing the climate crisis. And the only way to move off of that is for there to be a big enough shock that it makes us willing to take the steps that are needed to change the system. And so that's what I talk about in the book. And that's why that's what I talk about as the basis for my apocalyptic yet optimistic perspective on where we need to go with regard to solving the climate crisis as well.
Right. Late in the book, you talk about social change, and you have kind of this equation. You say social change equals direct activism and indirect activism. And I'd like you to explain the difference between direct and indirect activism. Yeah.
Yeah. So direct activism is the types of actions that you or I could take collectively or as individuals to actually have a measurable effect on climate change. And when I think about that, I mean, particularly a lot of times we talk about, what we call mitigation, which is the reducing the concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. We can do that by switching to an electric car. We can do that by eating less meat. We can do that by planting trees, right? We can do that by planting and getting rid of some of the asphalt that we have in our communities. Or one of the big things my community is doing is transitioning to electric school buses, right?
Mm.
All of those things are, actions that will have a direct effect on concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. But there are also lots of types of activism that involves trying to pressure those folks who are contributing potentially more to the climate crisis. That is businesses, trying to get businesses to change their policy. I personally cannot stop specific companies from doing something, but I can try to get them through, people who are on the board of directors of the company, or by, boycotting, or what we call boycotting, which is choosing to buy specific, purchase specific products because they are better for the environment. I can, indirectly have an effect. Probably the most common way that we think about indirect activism is through engaging in protest and lobbying behavior, which is basically the ways that we as citizens express, and engage in the democratic practice by trying to get policymakers to change policies that will then have an effect on climate change. For example, I again can't stop the way that the federal government, pushes companies and and utilities to shift to clean energy. But what I can do is tell, people here in the state of Maryland where I live, or people who work for the federal government, that I think it's really important for them to transition away from fossil fuel. But that's an indirect type of activism where I try to get somebody else to then change somebody's behavior. It's not that I'm directing changing behavior that has a measurable effect. It's a slow process, and that's the part that I write, that I wrote about specifically in the IPCC, which is a really challenging equation to try to figure out how it works. But it's one of the ways that we try to engage in democracy, and it's a really important part of our democratic practice, in my opinion.
Yeah. One of the chapters that really hit home for me as a writer and activist was your chapter 4, entitled "Saving Ourselves Won't Be Popular and It Will Be Disruptive." And you talk about it's becoming increasingly apparent that what you term incremental politics is not working. Yeah, just any reflections on that chapter and why that was important.
Yeah, so one of the things that we know is we know that activism, when people participate in social movements, if the social movements aren't successful over time, one of two things happens. Either people give up and they go back to, sitting on their couches watching Netflix, or they become more radicalized, which means that they start to engage in more confrontational activism to push back to try to get their voices heard in more effective ways. The climate crisis, as it gets worse and people experience the climate crisis firsthand. I mean, when I started out doing this, we were talking about saving saving the polar bears, and that was the reason that we wanted to do something on climate change. But now we're doing it so that we can stop wildfires spreading and extreme events of all sorts, right? So as the climate crisis wears on, more and more people are feeling like they have to do more to get their voices heard. They're not willing to give up on the movement, but they recognize that what they've done so far has not been enough. So what I try to do in that chapter is pull apart the ways that people might be engaging in more confrontational activism. And I should just say here that when I describe confrontational activism, I'm not talking about, blowing up a pipeline, which is the title of a very popular book that many people have read, which is not actually about blowing up a pipeline, I might say. But it's not about violent activism. It's about people engaging in activism that might not be exactly legal, that might involve nonviolent civil disobedience. And in fact, I've spent a lot of time talking and researching activists in the climate movement in the United States and in Europe. And none of them are talking about becoming violent right now. What they are talking about is trying to figure out how they can be more effective in getting their voices heard. And so in the book, I talk about some of these really attention-grabbing tactics that have been done by the groups that I call the shockers. And those are the folks who are engaging in these kind of small-scale performative acts, like, throwing soup, throwing paint, smearing paint. We've seen a lot of that to get attention. There's been a lot of crazy glue as well. Those types of
Mhm.
actions tend to be generally, for the general population, quite unpopular. And that's standard. In fact, the types of disruptive actions that the civil rights movement was very unpopular during the period of the civil rights struggle. But what those actions do is they help to gain public attention to the issue. And they do that through getting media attention. So this more like shocking behavior by a small number of people will get media coverage where the media is talking about these shocking acts, which are unpopular. But then they also talk about the climate crisis and why people are feeling so upset about it that they're willing to go into a museum and throw soup on the protective coating of, a piece of artwork and stuff like that. I end up doing a lot of media when those types of actions happen. And it does do what we call create issue salience, which means it gets more people to pay attention to climate change. And the research actually shows that in response to those types of acts, it doesn't make those acts any more popular. But what it does do is it makes people who are concerned about climate change personally get involved in more moderate components of the movement. So more people may decide to start working on, electric school buses or planting trees in their communities and all these other actions that we can take in our communities because they remember, climate change is real. I'm starting to experience it. My kids can't play on the playground right now because of the air quality. I should do something. But everybody does not need to go out and get arrested or throw soup for sure. But what I try to do in that chapter is lay out why those people are doing it and how it helps to expand the capacity of the movement to push back to get the kinds of changes that are needed.
Right. Um, in November of 2017, I actually moved to Duluth to join a local intentional community. It's a local Catholic worker community. So I really appreciate the section where you talked about creating community and building solidarity. And just any reflections or thoughts on why you included that in the book?
Yeah, I mean, so that's, I think, a really important component of what we need to do to save ourselves. And, I studied countless social movements over, 25 or so years that I've been an practicing sociologist. And one of the things that I've noticed is that the social movements that are most effective are those that build solidarity across identity, orientation, and social class. When we bring in people who care about a range of issues that overlap, to push back collectively. And it can be, through demonstrations, but it can also be through these kinds of local projects that are all about making change in your community. And one of the things that a lot of research on the climate movement shows is that um, to date, the climate movement does not do a great job of mobilize across identity, orientation, and social class. But it really needs to because that kind of solidarity is necessary to push back against these vested fossil fuel interests that are making decisions and have really quite substantial access to power right now in our country. So what I talk about there is the way to build solidarity and the need to think about how to cross you know, these different groups of, silos almost of people who are engaged and concerned about their communities. And we've seen examples of it. And, particularly talking about the kind of work that I expect that you're probably doing in your community, which is also about cultivating what we call resilience, is super important because it's all about building social ties in your community that support people when bad things happen. And it doesn't have to be bad things that are climate shocks, but it also means that people are there for one another when there are extreme events, when people need help because of the air quality, because of extreme weather, because of heat waves, because a disaster hits and you need food, you need electricity, your kids need to be picked up from school. All of those things are more possible when you have strong social ties and social resilience in your community.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. Actually, on January 21st, the day of the inauguration, we held a gathering at a local church called Coming Together for the Common Good. We had 80 activists come together from different groups to connect and to share interest and how we could support each other. So I really appreciate your comments.
That's exactly the kind of work that I think we need to see across the country right now.
Gotcha.
So I
Thank
think
you.
it's great to hear that you're doing it already in Duluth.
Thank you. Given all your work on the environment, climate change, where did this interest come from? Uh, yeah,
Okay, well, I mean, I guess so I grew up in the woods outside of Philadelphia. I pride myself on the fact that I frequently didn't wear shoes all summer, which is kind of funny now as a parent because when my kids don't wear shoes, it makes me very nervous. Um, and so when I finished college, I wanted to really make a difference, and I was really concerned about environmental degradation. I mean, we didn't really talk about the climate change just yet. It was the early 1990s. Bill Clinton had just started in the White House, and so I went to Washington, D.C. to make a difference by trying to be a lobbyist and trying to use, my knowledge and my skills to learn how to do that. What I learned, along the way is, first of all, that there's a whole system in place that is supporting and continuing the exploitation of our natural resources that also include the climate. And I also learned that I am not meant to be a lobbyist at all because I really like to bring data to power and dig into problems to figure out the solutions. And so, I spent, you know, I guess the first 10 years of my adult life trying to figure out how I could best be effective. And what I ended up figuring out is that the best way for me to do it is to be able to use the research that I do, which I love to do, and take those findings and try to help communicate what those findings tell us about how we can actually do the work better and be better for the environment. And so, I think about myself as, I work at the intersection of climate change and democracy. A lot of my work is about how to give, we individuals more power and more capacity to affect change in our communities and how to build strong, lasting social connections that can democratize everything. So, not just democratizing around climate, but democratizing around, all of the things that we need in our communities so that people have a voice in making those kinds of changes and in that decision-making process. But I think that I always end up coming back to climate change because the problem has just gotten worse and worse over the 25 years that I've been doing this work. And at this point, there are some people who have been thinking about whether or not, democracy can survive climate change and whether climate change will survive democracy or the failure of our democracy. So it's a really interesting place to look and try to think about how we as people can empower ourselves, can work together, can build community, can build solidarity, and how that can then lead us to, stop a lot of the environmental degradation that we're seeing in the world, which is really becoming quite dangerous.
right. I know for any of us who are either journalists, writers, academics, activists that work in the area of climate change, it can often be challenging, if not difficult. And so I'm interested, what motivates and inspires you to do the work you do?
Well, I mean, some days are not great days, right? I mean, it's hard to do this work and to be involved in it because as I mentioned, I spent a lot of time studying climate policy failures, which are, are heartbreaking to watch. For me, what inspires me, there are two things. I mean, one thing is my family and my children and watching my children grow up to become, responsible, one day responsible adults. Right now, they're working their way towards that. But in addition to that, I'm really inspired by my research. So I continue to study activists who are trying to get involved in participating and pushing back to decision making that they don't think is democratic and to policies that are going to harm the climate further, and watching the ways that activists are really building community is really heartening to me. At the same time, I'm also doing a lot of work studying how Service Corps are playing a role in responding and helping communities recover from disaster, including these climate shocks. And so I just spent last week in New Orleans working with folks actually outside of New Orleans in Jefferson Parish and learning about how they are building communities through community organizations, some of which are faith-based, some of which are community-based. All of them are preparing their communities before the hurricanes start hitting again, because hurricane season is coming. And watching these people take care of one another and support one another. I mean, sometimes it's about sharing recipes, and sometimes it's about telling one another about, fitness groups that they can join in their communities. And sometimes it's about making sure that everybody gets food and that there's electricity when disaster strikes. And I find that really inspiring. So I love spending time in the communities learning about how people are trying to create solutions for themselves, because you know, sometimes, and a lot of the time, I guess, we really can't count on the state or the market to do it for us, which is why I end the book saying, as unfair as it may seem, the future is up to us. And as unfair as it may seem, we can't wait for the governments to solve this problem, because they're just not doing it fast enough. We are, 30 years into a climate regime that is completely ineffective. So at this point, we got to do it together. And I'm so inspired by all of the ways that people are doing it already.
Great. It's closing to our interview, since we're here in Duluth, any words of advice or wisdom for a city or town like Duluth as we move forward?
Well, I would just say that you guys should all lean into the types of civic bonds you already have. And also, I mean, as horrible as moments in time, like the moment you're experiencing with the horrible air quality coming from the fires up in Manitoba, as horrible as those times are, and as much as people are feeling their lives being disrupted, when lives are disrupted by these kinds of shocks, it's a great opportunity to think about how to try to limit those shocks in the future and how to work together. So first of all, supporting one another as people are experiencing, horrible air quality days. I mean, I know from when we've had air quality days like that here in the DC area, that a lot of kids and asthmatics like me and my kids are really, affected, and people need more support, and just leaning into those social bonds you've already built to make them stronger, because we are as strong as the bonds that we build. So it's great that you guys are already doing that, but I think there's just so many more opportunities to build even stronger ones and use the bad times to build for the future.
Great. Well, it's really been great to have you with us today. I look forward to sharing this interview and your book with many people in Duluth. And as I mentioned earlier, we're going to be working on an activity later in June focused on climate activism in Duluth. And I think your book and this interview will be important resources in our collaborations here in Duluth in the future. So
Well, wonderful.
I really
I
appreciate.
hope I hope it's helpful, and please share what you produce, because I would love to help amplify it and also just see what you guys are doing, because it sounds like such important work, and it's a great time to be doing it because we're right in the middle of like wildfire and pre-tropical storm or early tropical storm season, so it's a great time to talk about this stuff.
Great, thank you. And to Duluth, I want to thank you for being with us today on the Climate-Duluth series. Hope you have a good day and take care, everyone.